I'd been awake for 31 straight hours by the time I reached the sliding doors of Terminal C, and the whole concourse smelled like burned espresso and ambition, both of which I'd mainlined all semester. Yet even in that bleary state, I felt the precise second my vacation died. It was the moment my own suitcase, an ostentatious champagne gold thing I'd bought secondhand on eBay, squeaked. Protest at a sudden U-turn because instead of rolling toward the check-in desk, I was dragging it right back out into the humid pre-dawn where taxis hissed like irritated cats. The airline clerk's eyes tracked me, puzzled, as though she'd just watched someone step out of a lifeboat and dive back onto the sinking ship. They say money can't buy love, but apparently it buys resentment at a 2-for-1 holiday discount, and I had just received the receipt. 12 hours earlier, give or take a little soul erosion, I'd been staring at the family group chat named July Cabin Extravaganza, 3 exclamation marks, the textual embodiment of my foolish optimism, while the screen erupted with chat bubbles that felt like mosquito bites. Time, my debt-ridden startup-failed 28-year-old brother had typed, "Stop flexing, kid. Not everyone can drop $3K on a glorified treehouse," to which Mom responded. Timothy language and Dad ever, the Switzerland of our domestic Cold War, added, "Let's keep the peace, children." I replied, "It's a gift, Tim. For all of us, because that was the truth." I'd ground 16 credits worth of scholarship overage and 6 months of barista tips and midnight essay editing gigs into a single shining weekend on a lake, complete with hot tub and panoramic deck, as a grand gesture that we might just once act like a functional sitcom family. Tim's counterpunch gift. Or ego trip, freeze frame on his avatar, him leaning against a rented Lamborghini with a taped-over license plate, #, bless the patron saint of financial delusion. That jab landed harder than it should have, echoing every time I frothed milk or formatted citations, because envy dressed up as moral superiority is still envy. And by 4 a.m., my brain fusing caffeine and fury whispered the nuclear option. So there I was, curbside thumb, hovering over a crimson button in the rental app cancel reservation, lakeside luxury chalet, non-refundable. $3,000 of flex money about to evaporate faster than dry ice in a TikTok experiment. One tap, a perky ding, and whoosh, months of double shifts translated into a single line of italics booking, canceled refund, $0. My phone burst into frenetic vibration. Mom calling. But I let it ring, watching the terminal doors reflect across the glass like closing theater curtains. Somewhere, a departing jet roared, dragging dawn across the horizon. And I thought, funny, the cheapest thing I've done today is lose $3 grand. I ducked behind a concrete pillar, scrolling up the chat history one more time, as if rereading an autopsy. Tim's words looked smaller now, like graffiti. Someone half-scrubbed, but never quite erased. The suitcase handle was sweaty in my grip, a reminder that I'd spent more hours bussing sticky pub tables than sleeping. Yet the heft felt lighter than the guilt I'd been lugging. Dad always taught me sunk cost fallacy. With poker metaphors, don't throw good chips after bad cards. So I decided to cash out before the emotional rake got steeper. That's when an elderly couple toddled past, arguing over boarding zones, and the woman hissed, "We wouldn't be in this mess if you'd listened." And I almost laughed, because eavesdropping on strangers occasionally gifts you fortune cookie wisdom. Listen sooner. If I'd listened to my own doubts weeks ago, maybe I'd have saved the money, but then I wouldn't have this moment of furious clarity. I opened notes, typed a single sentence, Act 1, cancel vacation, reclaim dignity, and hit save, labeling it receipt number 1. The plan, if you can call rage-hydrated improvisation a plan, crystallized step 1, kill the cabin. Step 2, let the fallout reveal everyone's true currency. As the rideshare arrived, I heaved the suitcase into the trunk. The driver glanced at my one-way trip notification and asked change of plans, to which I answered, "Just realized my family prefers drama to scenery." And he grinned, like someone who'd met that species before. The sun crested the parking garage, turning jet exhaust into gold filigree, and I thought borrowed sunshine returned. I silenced Mom's latest call, keyed in a text. Something came up, talk soon, and felt the ridiculous thrill of setting the first domino upright. Because yes, I'd just detonated a $3,000 Goodwill grenade, but the shrapnel would be facts, and facts have better aim than guilt. As the car pulled away, the terminal shrank in the rear view like a paper backdrop, and I whispered to no one, "Welcome to Act 1. Curtains up, casualties pending." Back in January, I promised myself that if I could survive 16 credits of calculus-flavored torture and 2 part-time jobs without accidentally collapsing into a coffee grinder, I would buy my family the kind of summer weekend Instagram begs for. So I stitched that dream together. Shift by shift, pouring foam hearts for strangers who mispronounced my name, and rolling sticky pub silverware until my fingerprints looked like barcode smears, then staggering back to a dorm room the size of a walk-in closet to edit other people's term papers at 2 a.m. The glow of my laptop became sunrise and budget spreadsheet all at once. Each green cell a mile marker toward lakeside luxury chalet, a phrase that tasted like toasted marshmallows and generational healing. Or so I told myself while microwaving 49-cent ramen. The funny thing about grinding is you develop an accountant's intimacy with every dime, so by June I could quote my checking balance faster than my GPA and still recite the exact price of oat milk in 3 competing supermarkets. Meanwhile, Tim spent money like it came with refills, Ubering across town instead of walking 5 blocks and pretending credit limits were mythical creatures someone else made up to scare children. He called once at midnight to brag that his startup's pre-seed round was basically locked words slurred by the clink of craft beer bottles. I muted my phone, finished proofreading a dissertation on corporate ethics, and thought corporate irony tasted better. My parents saw none of this disparity. To Mom, Tim was the charismatic eldest who'd take off any day now. And to Dad, he was the burdened visionary crushed by bad luck, whereas I was the reliable background process who would land on her feet no matter what, which is a nice compliment until you realize it means nobody plans on catching you. The night I hit my savings goal, I didn't celebrate. I screenshot the bank app, slapped it into a vision board already crowded with scholarship certificates, and a Polaroid of the lake, then opened a hidden voice memo app labeled Receipts, and replayed Tim calling me a show-off little brat during Easter brunch, his words syrupy with champagne. I kept that clip because I knew envy often masquerades as advice, and I wanted proof of the mask. 2 weeks before departure, we gathered for Sunday casserole, a ritual as bland as the food. Tim arrived 15 minutes late in a thrift store blazer that still had someone else's initials on the inside pocket, but looked expensive. If you only glanced, and I watched him scan the table like a CEO assessing assets before he pounced on my announcement. "I've booked the cabin, 3 bedrooms, hot tub full, deck facing the sunset, everything's covered. Consider it my treat." Mom clasped her hands as though the Holy Spirit had materialized beside the green beans. Dad said, "That's very generous, Peanut," in a tone suggesting he'd finally received evidence his parenting hadn't malfunctioned. Tim leaned back, arms folded, and asked, "And what exactly are you trying to prove?" The air-shifted casserole steam curdled into tension, curiously spiced with burnt ego. And I replied as sweetly as a macaron, "Proving is for science fairs, Tim. This is gratitude." He laughed short and sharp, called me Richie Rich under his breath, then louder so the neighbors could resent me too. Later, while Dad rinsed plates, Tim cornered me near the fridge, breath laced with cheap Merlot and expensive insecurity, and whispered, "You barely understand the value of $1, which was objectively hilarious, coming from a man who thought minimum payments were optional. I tapped my phone against his chest, Cash App still open to his latest $200 request, and said, "Actually, I understand dollars so well I can audit yours." He turned scarlet, muttered something about career stress, and stormed off, leaving Mom to smooth the evening like spackle over a cracked wall. That night, I lay awake tallying red flags until they formed bunting. Still, a stubborn hope insisted the trip would mend things, as though proximity to pine trees could photosynthesize dysfunction into hugs. Fast forward to the day before departure, I was dead on my feet after a double shift when my phone pinged with Tim's Lamborghini avatar accusing me of flexing in the family chat. The timing was perfect. My guard was down, my bank account freshly drained by final cabin charges, and his contempt hit like a sucker punch dipped in vinegar. I read his message 5 times, each repetition stripping varnish off my fantasy until only raw wood splinters remained. Then, somewhere between annoyance and clarity, the word cancel began to glow in my skull, pulsing to the rhythm of an exhausted heart. I tried to sleep. Instead, I drafted a mental ledger of everything Tim owed me, not just money, but apologies for birthdays he hijacked. With disasters of his own making the time he announced a broken engagement on my high school graduation morning, the afternoon he revealed a DUI right after Dad toasted my scholarship, the night he crashed my dorm move-in, to cry about an ex. Each memory, another marker of emotional inflation. By dawn, the sun lit up both the sky and the exit sign from naivety. I showered, packed, called a rideshare, and rehearsed indifference all the way to the terminal, telling myself I wasn't pulling the plug out of spite, but for self-defense. And yet, as I slammed that cancel reservation button, I felt both lighter and guilty because years of being the peacekeeper had wired reflexive remorse into my bones. But the calm that followed was quieter than guilt, deeper than spite. It was relief, subterranean and seismic enough to reroute fault lines. When Mom's call buzzed, I couldn't pick up, not while adrenaline still fizzed like shaken soda. So I watched the screen vibrate each unanswered ring, a tiny funeral bell for my former compliance. 31 sleepless hours, countless lattes, one colossal sunk cost later. I climbed into the back of a silver sedan, headed nowhere in particular. The driver glanced at my lone suitcase and asked if I'd missed my flight. No, I said I just changed destinations. He chuckled, pulled into traffic, and the city rolled past like tape in an evidence locker while I drafted receipt number 2 offer, rescinded due to entitlement. The next stop, or rather the next collision, would be a Zoom call I hadn't yet scheduled, but could already hear Dad's disappointed sigh like static Mom's pleas for family unity, Tim's outrage ballooning until it popped. I imagined that symphony and felt a smile and curl slow and sure, because this time when the guilt marinade started simmering, I'd serve it receipts instead of apologies. 9 a.m. on the dot, my laptop screen burst into 4 uneasy rectangles, and the family Zoom ambush began. Dad wearing his mediation polo as if cotton could referee blood. Mom's face puffed from crying, but still framed by perfect Christmas card curls. Tim half lit in what looked like a closet studio apartment camera, angled to hide clutter, yet failing to conceal the beer bottle chiming against his chair leg every time he shifted. I joined last, in a hoodie that smelled like stale espresso microphone-muted coffee mug raised in silent salute, the embodiment of calm they hadn't expected. Dad cleared his throat, a sound I'd heard before every lecture ever, and said, "Sweetheart, canceling the trip blindsided us." Mom chimed, "Your brother feels humiliated, as though humiliation were a natural disaster I'd triggered." Tim jumped in voice, caught between whine and accusation. "Do you have any idea how many people I told I already posted cabin photos?" Which was fascinating because I'd never shared those photos publicly. Apparently, mock-ups ripped from Airbnb now passed for reality in his influencer fantasy. I unmuted just long enough to thank them for attending, then muted again because silence is an underrated weapon. They talked over each other, seasoning the call with guilt like too much salt, until Dad finally addressed me directly. "Why would you back out at the 11th hour?" I unmuted, tilted my head, and asked one question. "How much do you need, Tim?" The rectangles froze. I watched pixels rearrange while they processed the shift from moral to monetary. Tim said $10,000 so fast it sounded rehearsed. Mom gasped. Dad rubbed his temples, same choreography as every financial storm. But I didn't flinch. Just clicked the little red RX button, so a crimson dot glowed beside their disbelief. "Credit card companies are vultures," Tim explained, framing himself as roadkill, pecked by interest rates. Mom pleaded family, helps family, the phrase used to unwrap every bailout he'd ever received. I sipped coffee, tasted burnt beans and déjà vu, then said, "Family also repays family. Your tab is still open." Dad called that unkind, but his voice trembled with the knowledge that my spreadsheet memory could cite exact loan dates and amounts down to cents. I shared my screen folder names in fluorescent spite. Cabin costs, pay stubs, family, debts. Each opening in crisp clarity. Invoices fluttered by hot tub reservation fee, sunset deck upgrade. The non-refundable deposit now vanished. Next came pay stubs showing nights I'd traded sleep for tips. Finally, a WAV file titled Tim Easter Brunch. WAV played his recorded sneer show-off little brat, echoing into their headphones like a ghost of contempt. Mom covered her mouth as though her fingers could rewind the sound. Dad's eyes hardened. Tim's face flushed beet, then gray. "That was private," he sputtered. "So is my credit score," I replied. I stopped the share, let silence fill, then said, "The only loan on offer today is a reality check." Tim exploded, calling me manipulative, selfish, a closet sociopath. His insults hit my mute button and bounced off useless without my reaction. He quit the meeting, mid-tirade his square, vanishing with a sad little boop. Dad leaned forward, remote authority crumbling, and delivered the ultimatum, help your brother or skip Thanksgiving. I thought of the last Thanksgiving Tim announcing he'd wrecked Mom's car right after the turkey hit the table, and felt nothing but relief at the prospect of missing gravy-soaked drama. "Then I'll be thankful for the quiet," I said, clicking leave meeting before their shock registered. My room fell silent, but for the laptop fans spinning like applause. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, noticing how light my chest felt with all that unspoken guilt finally digitized into evidence. The recording autosaved to a folder I renamed Boundaries. I stared at the timestamp 09:27 a.m., only 27 minutes to watch an empire of entitlement tilt. Somewhere outside, sirens wailed. Inside, a notification dinged. Tim had requested $500 through Cash App proof he still thought words could conjure cash. I declined, screenshotted the request, dropped it into the folder. Another ding, Dad emailing flight coupons in case you change your mind. I let it sit unopened, a relic of pressure tactics. Coffee finished, adrenaline ebbing. I lay back on my sagging futon and allowed the ceiling texture to blur into victory confetti. Guilt tried a last-minute comeback, whispering about family loyalty. But I countered with facts. $3,000 lost was tuition paid in self-respect, and the receipt had a permanent ink signature. Somewhere Tim would be spinning a narrative about my betrayal. Yet narratives without proof are just bedtime stories. I had the proof. The next chapter, Debt Collector's Identity Theft Revelations, waited beyond noon. But for now, I savored the rare stillness of a boundary enforced one silent rectangle in a Zoom grid suddenly louder than any apology I could ever utter. 43 minutes after I logged off that first call, my phone lit up with a new invite: family meeting, 2.0 mandatory, because Dad apparently believed brand new Zoom links could reboot reality. I accepted out of morbid curiosity, and at exactly noon, the grid reopened like a crime scene revisited. But this time, I seized the host role, disabled Tim's ability to mute me, and said without prelude, "Screen share commencing. Try to keep up." Folders bloomed across their monitors. Cabin costs, pay stubs, receipts. But the pièce de résistance was a freshly minted spreadsheet titled Tim Debt Protocol, where every dollar he'd siphoned since 2018 marched in red ink columns. Loans forgotten, utilities, covered parking tickets, just this once totaling $7, $426.57, and before interest, each line hyperlinked to proof. Venmo, screenshots, bank statements, even a PDF of Mom's frantic late-night text begging me to float Tim another $200 until Friday. I watched their faces tighten, seen like shrink wrap on bad leftovers. Dad's cursor fluttered near the total. Mom whispered a prayer. Tim stuttered that I was violating financial privacy, to which I replied, "There's no privacy in theft, only receipts." Then I played the Easter brunch audio again. Let the phrase show off little brat loop like a cursed ringtone until Tim lunged for his keyboard, yelling, "Stop it!" But I'd locked controls, so his anger ricocheted inside the grid. I paused, the loop leaned close to my webcam, and offered terms. "You want 10 grand? Here's the exchange rate, full repayment schedule, 5% annual interest, public apology, pinned to your socials for 30 days, and you revoke future expectations of my wallet, period." The silence felt refrigerated. Dad finally asked, "Is there room to negotiate?" I said. Of course he can also choose bankruptcy. Tim's nostrils flared, a bull smelling the matador, yet the ledger on screen left him hornless. He tried one last guilt pitch. Family should help, but Mom, eyes glassy, murmured, "Family also learns." And in that moment, her allegiance shifted, tiny but tectonic. I dropped the final slide, a legal template labeled, Promissory, note, sign here. My signature already in digital ink. Clock's ticking, I said, interest accrues in real time. Tim cursed Dad sighed. Mom closed her eyes as if receiving anesthesia. Then, with reluctant keystrokes audible through the speakers, Tim typed his name. Adobe flashed, signed, and filed 12:15 p.m. I ended the share, ended the meeting, and sat in the hush of my apartment, where the only sound was my own heartbeat steady for the first time in years because the arithmetic of boundaries had finally balanced to zero. Night seeped into my apartment like spilt ink, when an unknown number shattered the uneasy calm, and I answered mid-slurp of discount ramen, only to hear a voice so polite it felt predatory. Ms. Carter, we're calling regarding your delinquent platinum charge account balance, $7,842.13, which would have been hilarious if it weren't terrifying, because I never owned a platinum charge, at least not in any universe where consent mattered. So I froze long enough for the ramen to congeal, while the agent explained that 18 months ago I'd co-signed for a card alongside one Timothy Carter application approved within minutes. Congratulations, Ms. Carter, payments missed within weeks. Interest compounding like mold. A centrifuge of memory spun and landed on freshman move-in day. Tim barging into my dorm, waving a clipboard of student loan consolidation forms. I'd been distracted by a roommate sobbing over a broken mini-fridge, signed where he pointed and forgot. Now the signature was shackles clamped to my credit. I promised the agent a callback hung up, and adrenaline bulldozed every hint of fatigue. 10 minutes later, I stood outside Tim's girlfriend's basement suite, a converted laundry room perfumed by mildew and regret. The door swung open to reveal Tim in sweatpants, thumbs busy on a game controller, limited edition sneakers stacked behind him like trophies of denial. I tossed a photocopy of the platinum charge contract onto his lap, my scrawled name crisp at the bottom, and he blanched, stammering. That startup investors had vanished. He'd intended to pay it off after the Series A, which sounded like a bedtime story told by credit goblins. They're going to repossess my car, he muttered, gesturing to a key fob shaped like debt. I scanned the sneaker wall, Jordan Retros, Yeezys Off-White collaborations, secondary market gold, then pointed at them one by one, like a ruthless auctioneer. Size 10 dead stock fetches, $800. Limited drop, $1,200. Your emergency fund is staring at you in leather and hype. He tried guilt. Those are all I have left, and I replied. You also have my credit score, currently hemorrhaging on the floor. Tears pooled, real or rehearsed, but sympathy was a currency I'd devalued. I produced a stiff packet, debt repayment and public apology agreement, outlining monthly payments, sneaker liquidation schedule, social media mea culpa, and a clause that triggered immediate small claims action plus HR-bound evidence if he defaulted. He scanned it, jaw twitching. Behind him, a dryer rattled like courtroom drums. Just help me this once, he whispered, voice cracking, and I realized that for Tim, once was a Mobius strip, no beginning, no end, just perpetual entitlement. I knelt to eye-level steady as a bank auditor and said, help looks like accountability, sign or sink. After a 10-second eternity, he scribbled his name, ink blurring where a tear landed, and I countersigned, photographing each page for cloud backup. On my way out, I brushed past the sneaker wall and felt him flinch, not from theft, but from the realization I might actually force liquidation. Outside summer humidity clung like consequence. I dialed the collections agent, arranged a good faith payment from my emergency fund, painful but strategic, and emailed her a PDF of the freshly signed agreement, CCing myself, BCCing Mom for transparency. By the time I reached my hatchback, a text from Tim arrived, a picture of 3 shoeboxes loaded into his trunk with the caption, starting the purge. I allowed myself a thin smile because for once a Carter debt was shrinking instead of metastasizing. I drove home under streetlights that flickered gold, thinking how strange it felt to be both villain and savior in the same narrative, and how tomorrow I'd wake up lighter. Not because the burden was gone, but because I'd finally dropped it on the shoulders that created it. Sunday settled over Mom's backyard in a syrupy gradient of lavender and burnt peach, while solar-powered string lights blinked awake like drowsy fireflies, and I arrived carrying the thick manila envelope that felt heavier than any suitcase, because inside lay the final blueprint for peace built from legalese instead of wishful thinking. A folding table waited center lawn, its metal legs wobbling in freshly mown grass, and on it lay 2 neat stacks: Tim's sneaker liquidation receipts, and the notarized debt repayment and a public apology agreement, now embossed with a courthouse seal I'd splurged $50 on for theatrical gravitas. Dad hovered nearby, fiddling with his loosened tie, as though strangled by consequences. Mom clutched a pitcher of sweet tea, like it was holy water, and Tim stood barefoot, eyes red, a faint tan line, where designer shoes once lived, fingers twitching at the phantom laces of status he'd untied to keep the repo man away. No one spoke until I broke the hush. "We're here to consummate accountability." A sentence that made Mom flinch, but also straighten, because some part of her recognized the sacred weight of hard boundaries. I read the terms aloud: monthly $300 minimums, auto-drafted to platinum charge, until the balance hit zero. All proceeds from sneaker sales remitted within 48 hours of each transaction, apology video posted to Tim's Instagram, and pinned for 30 days, default clause triggering release of Zoom recordings, plus immediate small claims filing. And with each stipulation, Tim's shoulders slumped another millimeter, as if gravity had finally recalibrated to match reality. Pen chained to the table clinked like a tiny jail door when he grasped it, and the signature he scrawled looked shaky but genuine. I countersigned snapped photos for cloud backup, then slid copy B toward him with the soft satisfaction of a judge banging a gavel. Dad exhaled a bent sigh, part relief, part mourning for illusions lost, while Mom whispered a trembling thank you that felt addressed to all parties and none. Ceremony complete. I reclaimed my champagne gold suitcase from the porch. This time the wheels rolled smoothly. No squeal of protest, as if it sensed the cargo was lighter than before, packed only with my own clothes and none of Tim's expectations. A solitary 2-hour drive later, I pulled onto a gravel lane flanked by towering pines, their silhouettes stitched against a navy sky. And the rented lakeside cabin finally materialized, silent, vacant, mine alone. Inside, I lit the fireplace, though July heat still clung outside, because crackling wood felt like punctuation at the end of a years-long sentence, and I carried a steaming mug of cocoa onto the deck, where moonlight silvered the water into molten glass. Phone buzzed payment confirmation of Tim's first $800 sneaker sale screenshot, attached progress documented. Another ping, his apology video uploaded, thumbnail showing him in a plain t-shirt, eyes earnest caption reading, "Owning my mistakes, thank you sis for tough love." I saved both receipts to the boundaries folder, then activated a scheduled email to the debt collector confirming funds en route, CC'd Mom and Dad for full transparency. No secrets meant no leverage. Wind rustled pine needles like applauding spectators, and for the first time in 19 years, my pulse beat without background static of impending Tim drama. I sipped cocoa, watching steam waltz into the cool night, and composed a final note to myself on the phone: when guilt is offered as currency invoice in receipts. When love arrives with conditions, rewrite the contract. Sunshine isn't borrowed, you earn it. I hit save, tucked the phone away, and let silence swell. A vast, clean silence that tasted of cedar and earned freedom while distant loons called across the water like ushers dimming theater lights after the last encore, signaling that the show at last was over. Story 2. On my 10th birthday, Mom abandoned me, disappeared without a trace. She returned years later to inquire about the $100,000 settlement. In court, I thus exposed her. Hi everyone, Luca is my name. I currently reside in Bakersfield, California, and I am 23 years old. I own Aunt Patty's Pie, a small bakery, where I make pies every day while infusing the place with the sweet scent of memories I tried to forget, but was never able to. I was just 9 years old when my story started. I had the kind of life that most kids imagine before their parents got divorced. My childhood was filled with family movie evenings, laughter, and my mother's comforting touch on my head as I completed my schoolwork. However, everything changed when a storm hit our tiny home. Since Dad was no longer there, I used to think that Mom would be my refuge after the divorce. However, choosing to remain with her marked the beginning of a phase I never imagined I would have to endure. Mom started dating Mason a few months later, and I was never able to accept him. Due to his frequent presence, Mom Dahlia began to neglect me and arrive home late, each time Mason entered the room. My entire body tensed. It was too much for me to handle. Mom was furious with me because I acted out by talking back at people and sometimes staying silent. About a month later, she finally lost it after seeing me push back time and time again and said infuriatingly, "Luca, you have to learn to accept this." My throat tightened at the sound of those words. I thought that the only person I could depend on was leaving me. I always thought my mother would always love me, but I never imagined that her love for me would eventually feel more like a duty than anything sincere. On my 10th birthday, 2 months later, I completely lost her. I remember that morning so clearly. When my mother saw me still lying in bed, she came into my room carrying a small gift box. "Get ready," she said softly, giving me one of her rare smiles. "We're taking a short vacation for a few days." My heart rate went up. For a few seconds, a glimmer of hope emerged inside me. Maybe this trip will bring us closer together once more. I hurriedly gathered my things, being careful not to leave my plastic robot behind. My father's gift to me on my 9th birthday. Grant. Mom took me to a tiny house in Central California that afternoon. My late grandmother's younger sister welcomed us to Patty, who appeared taken aback when we showed up at her door and said, "Dahlia, why didn't you call first?" "We're just here to relax for a few days," Mom said with a smile. With a warm nod, Luca agreed that he wanted to enjoy some country air and a party. Mom held me as we slept on a potty sofa that night. I was certain she still loved me at that very moment because I could feel the warmth of her arms around me. In the comfort I hadn't experienced in months, I dozed off when her significant other came into her life. I was unaware at the time that it would be the last time she would hold me. The house was oddly quiet when I woke up the following morning. Above me, the only sound was the steady, slow hum of the ceiling fan, which sounded like the heartbeat of a quiet home. I sat up a few seconds later and looked around the room for my mother. I shouted her name out loud as I hurried into the kitchen and then out onto the porch, but nobody answered. I searched for about 15 minutes before going back inside, where I curled up on the couch and gripped my plastic robot, my only surviving friend. An hour went by, and then 2. I waited, with the hope that she had just left for a moment and would be back soon. Eyes were fixed on the door. I was sitting there terrified. It threw open the front door. Hoping and praying it was her, I jumped up. But my heart sank when I saw Aunt Patty walk into the living room. My mother was nowhere to be found. Aunt Patty asked, her voice trembling, "Where's your mom, Luca?" I went cold. I felt a burning pain in my chest. Mom had completely disappeared. No note had been left by her, not even a farewell. All she left behind was the prospect of visiting fields goats and the countryside. A journey never meant to bring us closer. Instead, they left me behind. I had no idea how the thing I was so excited about would ultimately alter my early years. That's when I realized the sad reality. The most devastating gift my mother had ever given me was her abandonment on my 10th birthday. And when Patty realized my mother was gone, she sat next to me. She tried to speak quietly, but her eyes grew worried. "Luca, your mother will return," she whispered, as she took my hand. "Do not be concerned." Then she ran to the landline and kept dialing my mom's number. But all we got was that endless ring of hollowness, and as a 10-year-old, I was at a loss for what to do but sob uncontrollably. My tiny chest felt like it was being crushed by the fear, and Patty graciously took me into her embrace after observing my feelings while she did so. Her eyes conveyed a sense of helplessness. Two strangers united by a choice neither of us had asked for were there. I waited for Mom to come home that first week by sitting at the window every day with my eyes fixed on the dirt road outside. The memories of those first few nights at Aunt Patty's tormented me. Each time I closed my eyes, I was taken back to the family court custody hearing. When my mother was given full custody of me, I recalled how Dad and Mom sat in silence. There was no shouting or argument, just a dense, terrible silence. I recalled the heated arguments that had taken place when Dad had visited home infrequently. Being a Marine, he was constantly absent. In those vague recollections, he often shouted when he finally came back. Mom's angry and irate voice was still audible as she yelled at him, saying he never truly cared about us. I could still feel that rawness, that grief. I was aware that his extended absence had left her feeling depleted, alone, and abandoned. My understanding deepened as I got older. I could feel their unhappiness. Maybe that's why she was unable to stay with him. However, the memories did not end with the disputes. I also recalled the day my dad got in the car and drove back to base, which was the last time I saw him. He whispered after giving me a quick look, "Luca, wait for me. I will return for you." It broke my heart to think of that promise. I miss him. He gave me a farewell hug in the courts, and I miss that. The sorrowful and ashamed expression in his eyes, for not being able to stay and keep our little family together. And when I thought about all of that, the tears would flow anew. All I had left was the plastic robot. He gave me a tiny sign of optimism and a recall of a promise I still held on to. I felt trapped in a storm with no way out at the time, and I couldn't help but wonder if Dad's promise would ever be fulfilled. After a week of waiting for Mom and no sign of her return on potty, and I reluctantly accepted that she was not coming back for me. From that day forward, I lived in on Patty's little house in Central California. It was a strange area for me, with low wooden fences and the incessant clatter of an ancient ceiling fan, and Patty lived alone. She was forthright, and she never veiled her feelings toward children. One afternoon, in a flat, matter-of-fact manner, she looked at me and stated, "I live alone for a reason. I'm not cut out to raise anybody's kid." Hearing those words hit me hard. My heart sank, and I cried profusely that day. I knew I was not welcome. I realized I was nothing but a burden for her, except even when confronted with a withdrawn little boy who did nothing except cry and clutch to a plastic robot, waiting day after day for a mother who would not return. And Patty couldn't ignore me. A few days later, she decided to put her pie business on hold and drive me back to our old house to hunt for Mom. When I found out she was taking me, I felt that flicker of hope come back. I pictured seeing Mom and leaping into her arms as I used to do after travels with Dad. But when we arrived, the house was completely shut up. Weeds have taken over the yard. The neighbors informed us that she had sold the house and gone away with her lover, leaving no contact information behind. When I heard that, a sudden, excruciating ache surged through my chest. Aunt Patty was enraged when she found my mother had abandoned me and purposefully placed me on her without saying anything. She drove me to the Child Services Center. But as we stopped at the front gate, she took my hand and said firmly, "Come on, you're going home with me." That sentence felt like the sun breaking through the darkest storms of my life. I nodded without hesitation, and she led me away through the bustling streets, complaining about being stuck with a kid like me. Honestly, I'm glad Aunt Patty changed her mind. I'm not sure where I would have ended up if she hadn't. After more than 2 weeks of living with Aunt Patty, I gradually adapted to the pace of life in Central California. I still waited for my mother every day, but my hope began to erode. My dreams about her stopped coming every night, and I began to realize that she was not coming back. Though hesitant at first, Aunt Patty gradually began to care for me in her own manner. Perhaps it was a pity for the child who had been left behind when Mom baked. She would always keep the finest slice for me. Every morning, she prepared a basic breakfast and barked shoo, "Don't start smelling." As for me, the boy who had previously exclusively played with robots and toy cars, I gradually became accustomed to the dirt, grass, and filth of the countryside. Then one little occurrence occurred on Patty, and I went to the market one morning. In her typically caustic tone, she replied, "Stick with me, don't get lost." But as she was picking out flour for baking, I noticed someone who looked like my mother. My heart raced. I raced after the figure, crying, "Mom!" I maneuvered through the crowd, calling her name repeatedly until the woman turned around, and I realized it wasn't her. That was the moment I realized I'd lost Aunt Patty. Panic overcame me. I looked about, but didn't know where I was. The familiar feeling of being abandoned returned, and my legs began to tremble. Nearly an hour later, I was sitting behind a dumpster behind the market, and Patty had handed me a pastry earlier, not to eat, but to hold on to. I simply sat there frozen. Then unexpectedly, I heard urgent footsteps. I looked up to see Aunt Patty. Her hair was a disaster. She was out of breath, and her eyes were filled with concern. She hurried up to me, knelt and held me hard. Her voice trembled as she said, "I thought I lost you, though I really lost you." At that moment, I trembled not just from terror, but also from the tremendous emotion of being actually cared for. It was the first time I felt something so intense from her, and in that instant, I realized these two strangers had transformed into something more. We were no longer separated after nearly a month, without hearing from my mother, I noticed, and Patty had gotten quieter. There was a worry in her eyes that she never spoke aloud. Then one day, Mom made a life-changing decision. She opted to formally adopt me. When Alma, my next-door neighbor, discovered that my mother had left me at Aunt Pat's, she stepped in to help. She produced the required documentation and gently walked her through the guardianship process. Thanks to Alma, once everything was completed and authorized, I was able to return to school, have regular checkups, and officially become a member of Aunt Pat's modest home. After everything they had done for me, something within me began to thaw. I no longer felt like an abandoned child. My second mother, Aunt Patty, was already in her 60s. She never said "I love you," but her care breakfast and pies provided me with a sense of security that I had believed was lost forever. Alma, who later became my instructor, was always quietly present. Her presence in the school hallways and the way her eyes supported me without saying anything provided solace on the days when I missed my mother the most. She became my anchor, especially as the next storm in my life approached. Patty raised me with all the love she had learned as a first-time mother. Throughout the 5 years I lived with her, I was a stubborn teenage boy back then, and I occasionally irritated her, but she never slapped me, yelled at me, or threatened to leave. Whenever I apologized, her eyes softened. Then she'd bring me into her loving embrace and hug me like a true mother. I gradually adjusted to life in the rural core of Central California, having grown up in a metropolis with playgrounds and televisions. Patty would accompany me to the town market on weekends where trays of fresh, fragrant pies were displayed. She taught me how to wrap them, how to meet guests, and most importantly, how to appreciate every dime we made in the evenings beneath the dull yellow light. She'd tell me stories about her life, like why she chose to live alone, why she decided to bake, and even give her secret recipe, which she had never shared with anyone before. Her stories sank into me. They made me fall in love with baking, and gradually, I began to feel like I belonged there. But then, 5 years later, shortly after I turned 15, on a cold winter morning, Patty died softly and gently in her bed. I recall how sharp the cold was that year, as if it was piercing through my skin. But the true pain came from the sudden void she left behind. As I prepared for school that morning, I noticed her familiar brown shoes in the corner of the room. I entered her bedroom and noticed her lying still on the bed. I assumed she was sleeping in due to tiredness, but then a concept struck me like a punch in the chest. In all those years, she had never slept. After 5 a.m., she was constantly getting up and leaving the house before I opened my eyes. Fear gripped me as soon as I realized this. I called her name repeatedly, but she did not answer. I dashed to her side, shaking her and shouting out harder, but she didn't reply. Her face appeared calm, as if she were sleeping soundly, but she was gone forever without a farewell. But the worry I felt then was not simply about losing her. It was based on the news I received after her death. 3 days after Patty was laid to rest, a child protective services worker visited the house. The woman wore a thick coat, held a clipboard, and spoke softly but coldly. Since there is currently no legal guardian listed, Luca will need to be placed in a youth care facility. When I heard that, it seemed like all the oxygen had been stolen from my lungs. At the time, I was too young to live alone. And under California law, I couldn't stay at Patty's residence without a legal guardian or an active custody order. Even though it was the only place I had ever known as home, my throat clenched as I realized there was nowhere else to turn. Alma was standing next to me when she began to cry. She consented to become my temporary guardian so that I could stay at Patty's house. In the days that followed, I lived alone in the small house Patty had left behind, relying on the modest resources she had accumulated over time. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me motivated to continue baking and keeping her spirit alive. After Grandma died, I began baking in my spare time, utilizing the recipes she left behind to earn a living while keeping her near to my heart. After months of trial and error, I succeeded in recreating her favorite flavor, warm, fragrant apple cinnamon. Alma took a little video of me writing, "I miss you" on one of the pies while I was peacefully baking in the familiar kitchen. She later sent me the video with an encouraging message, and I used it to enter my first baking competition when I was 16. My pie garnered good marks from the judges, and even more unexpectedly, the video went viral online, touching the hearts of many. It was the first stepping stone that led me to a future profession. For a brief time after everything that had occurred, I envisaged a brighter future in which each pie connected me to party. But I never expected that moment to turn my life upside down again. After more than 2 years of living alone in Patty's little house, I eventually adapted to the sedate, regulated pace she had left behind. Alma's calm support helped me grow up. I learned to care for myself and live frugally with the money I earned from selling pastries at the weekend market. I learned to handle every dime by listening to the oven as if it were my own life. Then one day, in early July, I received a letter from the city of Bakersfield with a notice of land reclamation. Patty's home was directly in the line of a planned federal highway expansion. By law, I had 60 days to answer, and if I accepted, I had up to 90 days to depart the premises. The government gave over $100,000 as compensation. When I received the notice, I held the letter for a long time, unsure whether to be delighted or unhappy. If I accepted, I'd get the money, but would lose Patty's home, the location I'd called home. The site is full of memories. My mother abandoned me, and this is where I was cherished and cared for. Alma, my temporary guardian, began assisting me with the paperwork to get the money and find a new place to live. We intended to start a separate account, set aside some funds for rent, and save the remainder for the future. However, just a few days after the initiative was publicized on the news, the woman who had previously abandoned me returned. Dahlia, my mother. That day, as I was packing to relocate, my mother unexpectedly appeared at the gate. She stood there in the midday sun, resting against the old wooden fence. Her face exhausted, and her eyes red and swollen, as if she had just cried when I stepped out onto the porch. She looked at me trembling and whispered, "Luca, it's me. I miss you the moment I saw her." My entire body froze. Even if my recollections of her had faded with time, her voice and gaze remained imprinted on my consciousness. After all those years of being left behind, I was curious what I would do if she returned. I envisioned her apologizing, crying, or simply stopping over to see me for a bit before departing again. But when it happened, I felt neither happy nor upset. Instead, I felt empty inside. After what she had done to me, I didn't want to believe anything she said, but I didn't want to quarrel either, and part of me hoped that this time she would try to make things right. Alma was in the hospital after having a baby and couldn't help me deal with it. After much thought, I allowed my mother in. She remained temporarily in the living room. Dahlia acted kindly over the first few days. She recalled old memories and informed me that she had spent years looking for me, but had never found me. Patty informed her that I had been sent to a children's center. She cried, held me, and said she cared. Her words jolted me. I had no idea whether what she said was true or false, but after years of wishing to be near my mother, I began to believe she had changed. But deep inside, I kept my guard up. Something about her seemed strange in her words and in her gaze. Something was wrong. Several days later, things began to seem peculiar. She began criticizing my father, claiming he was irresponsible and abandoned me. Then she turned to Party and accused her of being greedy and keeping me in control of the money. Dahlia gradually began asking questions about the land settlement, such as, did the money arrive yet? Whose name is on the account? Is the deed in Patty's or your name? I gave evasive responses, but within, I got increasingly nervous. Then, one late weekend afternoon, I returned home earlier than normal after selling pastries. I inadvertently overheard Dahlia on the phone in the kitchen. I froze in the hallway, listening to what she murmured. "He's not 18 yet. Don't worry. As soon as the money hits the account, I'll come right back to you." When I heard that, my heart felt like it erupted out of my chest. Our bond may be healed, and the lady who once abandoned me might still love me. But to her, I was nothing more than a name on an inheritance document. I hoped she'd come back for me. I assumed she regretted everything. I wanted to offer her an opportunity to make things right. I tried not to let the past turn me resentful. I promised myself that if someone sincerely apologized, I could forgive. But that was not the case. And after all the anguish she had caused, I was choked up. I felt my tears fall. I felt terrible for myself and was so hurt that I could not breathe. Around a minute later, I decided to confront her. When she saw me, she leaped her eyes wide with fear before she could respond. I stepped forward. I didn't say anything. I simply bent down, grabbed her luggage and a few items she had on the table, opened the door, walked out to the yard and flung everything down the porch steps. Her belongings clattered on the cement in the fading light. Then I walked back in, grabbed her wrist, and guided her to the door. As she came onto the porch, I let go, looked her in the eyes, and spoke each word in the calmest, most unambiguous voice I could manage. "Get out!" Dahlia burst into tears as she realized my commitment. She called me ungrateful and said I didn't love my mother, but I did not answer. At the time, I was only thinking about one thing: how to protect myself. I'd been living alone in that house since I was 15. I prepared for myself and made every dollar count. I learned to cope with loneliness and to set boundaries with those who hurt me. I contacted Alma right after Dahlia had left. A few days later, with Alma's support and the assistance of a community lawyer, I established a trust fund in my name. The settlement money was paid immediately into it and will be retained until I reach 18. I couldn't touch it right away, and no one else had access. When I was 18, I graduated from high school with good grades. When asked if I was going to college, I simply shook my head. Lecture halls and so-called steady employment on paper were not for me. I already knew my way, which smelt like cinnamon, was warmed by the hum of the oven and crisped with the first piece of apple pie. Patty's former path. I went to Bakersfield with my previous compensation money, after covering rent and living expenses and contributing to the trust fund. I rented a modest area at the end of a street near the farmer's market and parking lot. My small bakery had no showy signage or modern decor, just a plain glass front and a few old wooden tables and chairs inside. I hung a picture of Patty and a hand-carved wooden placard that said "Pies for the ones who stay." I named the store on Patty's Pie. In the days that followed, I began selling pies baked using her secret recipe. First, a few interested customers came by, but then, owing to an old YouTube video, Alma posted a 15-year-old me silently preparing pies. It resurfaced on Instagram and Facebook. People crowded in looking for the apple pie boy. Some days I had to get up at 3 a.m. to keep up with orders. And despite its size and simplicity, my small bakery was always busy. Some individuals drove nearly 2 hours for a slice of pie, hoping to enjoy the flavor of childhood that so many had complimented. Others brought their children, wanting them to experience the flavor of remembrance. In those moments, watching familiar customers savor each bite with satisfaction, I felt as if Patty was still here, beaming through every pie. Alma no longer served as my legal guardian in subsequent years. Instead, she became my spiritual guardian. She'd stop by the bakery on weekends, sit in her customary corner, read a book, and get the same thing, a slice of pecan pie with whipped cream and no sugar. We didn't say anything, just sat quietly, as if two people were clinging on to the memory of a woman who had never completely departed. 4 years later, when I reached 22, the bakery had grown well beyond my wildest expectations. From a modest little area with no signboard, it now has a website, regular customers, a YouTube channel with cooking videos, and a few viral films with hundreds of thousands of views. But that attention brought challenges I hadn't sought for. Every time a news story about a youngster who bakes using a deceased person's recipe appeared, a few strangers showed up. They claimed to be relatives or longtime family friends. Some insisted that I was their long-lost child. At first, I kept quiet, smiled, and let it go. But it eventually wore me down. I filmed a video for my channel one night after a long shift in it with a calm yet forceful voice. I said I have no parents. The person who raised me is gone. Please don't come here out of curiosity or to take advantage or to insert yourselves into stories you made up. This is my bakery. It's not a place for people to come looking for what they chose to throw away. After that, things settled down for a while until the afternoon. I was scrubbing the counter when I heard the faint chime of the doorbell. An older man walked inside when he saw me. He said nothing except 1 slice of apple pie, please, and a glass of water. I nodded. But something about that voice resonated deeply in my recollection. I couldn't identify it right first, but it seemed hauntingly familiar. When I brought out the pie, he was already seated at the table near the window. He remained quiet for a long time. No phone, no pictures of the food like the other customers, just a fork in his hand, staring out the window at the street. As I turned to return to the kitchen, he murmured softly. Luca, hearing my name shouted like that, made me pause in my tracks. The way he said it caused my hands to shake. At that moment, I recognized the voice. I had heard the same voice during brief trips when he was on leave. The same voice that once said, "Wait for me, Luca. I'll come back for you." My legs felt wobbly as I walked back toward him. He cautiously took out an old, fading photo. The photo depicted a simple birthday party for a small boy in a red sweater embracing a silver robot tightly to his chest. That was me at 9 years old, and the robot I still had it stashed away in Patty's wooden box. I froze when I saw that photograph. I couldn't look up because I wasn't prepared to face what might happen next. A few seconds later, he stood up and softly grabbed my trembling arm. Then he spoke slowly. "It's me. Luca. I came back for you." Everything appeared to slow down. As soon as those words fell, the world went silent. There were no oven sounds in the background, no customers, and no breeze outside the window. Just me and the man who once held me outside a courthouse and said, "Wait for me, Luca. I'll come back for you." After a few seconds, I looked up and caught his gaze, finally feeling peaceful. I saw tears and long buried exhaustion, as well as a calm melancholy laced into every strand of gray hair. It wasn't the look of someone seeking forgiveness. It was the expression of someone hoping to recapture a small piece of the child he had once lost. After seeing that birthday photo from when I was 9, the vision of the man in uniform came flooding back. He was the one who showed me how to fold a blanket neatly, the one who lifted me onto his shoulders and sprinted across the backyard, the one who always stated, "You're the one thing I never want to lose." A minute later, we sat down at the table together. He began to talk in a deep, raspy tone full of effort. He informed me that following the court verdict, all rights to me were taken away from him. He had left stillness and an unnamed emptiness in the background of his daily life. He once considered resisting. It once nurtured the notion of recovering his status as my father. However, he sustained terrible injuries while on an overseas deployment. A bullet tore deep into his shoulder, keeping him in the hospital for over 2 years. Throughout that period, he lived on the precipice of consciousness and oblivion, the misery seeping into every restless, fragmented sleep. When he finally recovered, he was left with only his military jacket inside the pocket. There's a little notebook with faded corners. He had scribbled my birth date on one of those pages with a slightly slanted hand and faded blue ink. Rain and sweat had obscured the ink, but it was still visible. He glanced at that page for a long time before closing the notebook as if searching for a passage through the desert, carrying it with him. He started looking for me from scratch. Every day involved sifting through old memories, revisiting old places, looking up names in internet directories, and asking people who had previously worked with my mother. Then, one day, while browsing a local news website, he came across a brief item about a handcrafted pie business in Bakersfield. The photograph depicted a business corner with an ancient wooden sign, a tray of steaming apple pies, and a black and white image of a woman standing next to an oven behind the counter. A young man rested his hand on a silver robot. At that moment, he didn't need confirmation. He knew it was me, and he came to find me. My throat dried up as I sat in the shop, listening to my father speak. My eyesight was hazy, not from tears, but from all of my emotions colliding at once. Too much to express. After he finished, I moved closer to him. I threw my arms around that man, clinging on to the quiet that had existed between us for years, and for the first time since Potty had departed. I felt the warmth of another loving embrace. It wasn't loud, it was not staged. This was the truth. Standing peacefully between two guys, one a father, the other his kid. After my father returned with that old photo, I opened my heart. We gradually resumed chatting. after 12 years starting with that first hug. Initially, it was small talk and simple queries similar to when I first started baking. The conversations gradually moved to old memories of family and childhood times that I thought I'd forgotten. My father had been a Marine after being discharged and recovering from his injuries. He began working as a counselor at a veteran training center. That employment allowed him to maintain a regimented routine that was stable enough to support him, while yet being flexible enough to reconnect with civilian life. Finding me was an important element of that life. We didn't talk every day, but he called every few days to see if I had time. Sometimes he dropped by the bakery near closing time, sat at the same window table, and ordered his usual slice of apple pie. Some evenings, he simply sat quietly. On other occasions, he'd tell old stories, but he mostly listened to me. And Patty's Pie had grown far beyond its humble beginnings. It was no longer a one-person business with a few tables. I had leased the 2 adjacent premises, torn down the walls, and tripled the shop size. I split the area into 3 sections, one for baking, one for service, and the remainder for clients to sit and relax in a nice cafe. I hired and educated personnel and parties. Identical style baked, gently serve kindly, and treat every customer like family. The bakery began to develop a reputation. People came not only for the flavor, but also for the tale behind each pie. The story of an abandoned youngster who grew up in his gray-tinted kitchen and founded a shop in his mother's name. I did not market much, but word spread. One week, my double-layer lemon apple pie, a variant on Patty's original, became viral online. Customers queued up down the block. Some people pre-ordered a week in advance. The oven remains hot all day. Staff rotated shifts non-stop. I thought I discovered a stable existence work every day. My father comes every week. New regulars appear each month. I genuinely assumed I had progressed past the worst phases. But then I remembered that my life had never followed a straight line. My mother returned on a busy Saturday morning during the bakery's peak rush and found a lengthy queue of customers eager to try our newest pie. However, this time, it was not about money. She came since she knew my father was present. That day, I was in the kitchen instructing the crew when I suddenly heard a tremendous boom on a table and a woman's voice saying, "Where are you, Luca? Come out here. I gave birth to you. You do not get to abandon me." When Delia saw my father sitting at the window, she marched right up to him and screamed, "Do you think you can steal him from me? He's my son. I gave birth to him." My father gently set down his fork. He stood up, squared his shoulders, and looked her directly in the eyes. Then with a calm yet forceful tone, he said, "Delia, that's enough." Before she could speak again, he pointed at me and raised his voice. "Last time I was unable to defend my son, but this time I won't let you take another step." Dahlia laughed dryly and bitterly sneering. She looked at me and exclaimed, "Who do you think you are shutting me out? If I hadn't abandoned him back then, he wouldn't have any of this today." Her comments boomed across the large room, and one of my staff began recording the moment she walked in and began ranting, ignoring my father's warning. Dahlia hit the table again, knocking over a plate of pies and spilling water on a customer's table. Some individuals stood up and stepped back in disbelief. The police arrived within minutes after her outburst. I contacted them as soon as I heard her scream. They restrained her as she kicked and yelled, repeating the same lines about how I was ungrateful and had betrayed the woman who gave me birth. But none of that mattered now. Her wrath resulted in her being forcibly removed and transported to the station. I walked up and stood behind my father as she was led out. Then, in a calm and clear tone, I looked her in the eyes and said, "You gave birth to me." But Party showed me how to live. 1 week after the incident, I hired a lawyer and filed a civil complaint against Dahlia and Kern County Civil Court, where my bakery operates. I sued her for 3 reasons: public disruption, trespassing on private land, and child abandonment. Even though the abandonment occurred years ago, the bakery's video camera captured her claims, along with corroborating papers from Alma's care records and testimonies from my employees. The court accepted the case. During the hearing, the court determined that my mother was civilly liable for a total of $12,000 in damages, including $1,000 administrative fine for producing a public disturbance, $2,500 in compensation for property damage at the bakery, $5,000 for emotional suffering and loss of childhood. The plaintiff's legal fees and court costs total $3,500. In addition, the court granted a 5-year restraining order preventing Dahlia from coming within 200 feet of my home or employment. After that hearing, I didn't feel happy. I did not feel vindicated. But for the first time since Mom left me, I felt completely safe. I understood that pursuing legal action against my mother would elicit conflicting reactions. But for me, maintaining peace was the final and vital step in protecting myself. 6 months after my father found me, our relationship became quiet and tranquil. Not too loud, not full of words. Just morning coffees with someone across the table and calm evenings knowing someone would phone to tell me to get some sleep. Today, as I share this story with you, is also the day I honor Patty, who died when I was 15. This morning, I awoke earlier than usual, put a tray of lemon apple pies in the oven, and waited quietly, waiting for the aroma to fill the room. This is how I remember her. Not with tears, not with flowers, but with the things she had left behind. Today commemorates the 5th anniversary of Aunt Patty's pie. I did not hold a grand celebration. I just hung a little photo next to Patty's image showing me at age 10 standing beside the first kitchen counter she ever gave me. After everything that has transpired, I do not seek vengeance. I don't require acknowledgement. Patty softly taught me to be compassionate, and I wish to live that way. In a world over which I have no control, I cling on to what is most important, a little kitchen, a familiar table, a bakery named after the woman who would never let go of me, and the one who remained. That is where my story ends. But I've got one question for you. What are your thoughts regarding my decision? Would you have done the same in my position? And do you believe my mother deserved the consequences she received? Share your opinions in the comment section below the story. And if this tale resonated with you, please subscribe to help support the channel. I will be back soon with more true stories from my life. See you at the next one.